On a Saturday afternoon in August of 1987, at the Harlan County Fair in Nebraska, a John Deere dealer named Dale Pruitt climbed up onto the hood of his brand-new 4955 tractor, put a bullhorn to his mouth, and announced to everyone within 200 yards that he was putting $8,000 on the line. The crowd near the pull track stopped moving. Children tugged at their fathers' sleeves. Women turned from the pie tables. Dale Pruitt's voice carried over the diesel smoke and the smell of fried dough, and he said it again, louder this time, so nobody could claim they hadn't heard. $8,000 says my 4955 beats every tractor on this field today, including that rusted-out Farmall that old Roy Hennessy dragged in here on a flatbed. Roy Hennessy was standing 40 feet away when he heard his name. He did not look up. He was checking the drawbar connection on his 1952 Farmall M, running his thumb along the hitch pin the way a man checks something he has checked 1,000 times before. He was 63 years old, lean as fence wire, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak as his barn beams. He said nothing. He kept his eyes on the hitch. Around him, the people nearest to Dale Pruitt's announcement laughed, and the laughter spread the way laughter does at a county fair, carried on the wind, handed from one person to the next, until it reached people who hadn't even heard what was said. The stakes were already posted on the pull committee's chalkboard at the end of the track. First place in the modified stock class paid $1,200. The Harlan County Pull Finals were the county fair's main event, and the thing people drove 2 hours to see, and this year the modified stock class had drawn 9 entries. But none of that mattered now. Dale Pruitt had made it personal. He had made it $8,000 personal in cash, which his sales manager, Randy Fowler, was already holding up in a bank envelope for the crowd to see. The pull committee chairman, a retired county extension agent named Bill Sutter, looked deeply uncomfortable. He walked over and confirmed with Dale that the side bet was real, that the money was genuine, and that he was willing to have it held in escrow at the fair office until the pull was done. Dale Pruitt said he was absolutely certain and absolutely willing, and smiled the smile of a man who had already written the ending. Roy Hennessy had driven the Farmall M to the fairgrounds that morning on its own tires, named 41 miles from his property outside of Alma. He had left at 5:30 in the morning to arrive before the gates opened. The tractor sat on the pull track apron now, its red paint faded to the color of old brick, its front tires slightly narrower than the rear axle assembly, its engine ticking quietly as the metal cooled in the afternoon air. It looked, to most of the people at that fair, like something that belonged in a museum. Several teenagers had taken photographs of it, not out of admiration, out of the particular amusement that young people feel when they believe they are looking at something obsolete. Dale Pruitt's 4955 was parked at the far end of the apron, and it was a different world entirely. Introduced by John Deere just that year, the 4955 produced 170 horsepower at the PTO. It weighed a little under 18,000 pounds without ballast. Its green paint was the kind of green that seemed to generate its own light in the afternoon sun. Dale had it loaded with rear wheel weights for the pull, bringing the total weight to just over 21,000 pounds. He had driven it to county fairs and implement shows across 3 counties that summer. It was his flagship unit, his showroom floor on wheels, and he treated it accordingly. He had a hired driver, a young man named Cody Watts, who had pulled competitively in the modified stock class for 3 seasons, and Cody was already walking the track, studying the surface the way a golfer studies a green. What Dale Pruitt did not know, and what almost no one at the Harlan County Fair knew, was that Roy Hennessy had been watching tractor pulls since 1954. But that is getting ahead of the story. The modified stock pull class in Nebraska in 1987 had specific rules. Tractors could be modified within limits. Certain carburetor and fuel injection changes were permitted, tire changes within size regulations, ballast up to a defined maximum. The sled they pulled was a transfer sled design, meaning as the tractor moved forward, the weight shifted progressively toward the front of the sled, increasing the load as the pull continued. Full pull was 100 feet. Anything short of 100 feet was scored by distance. The class was organized by tractor weight, and Roy's Farmall M, even with the modifications it carried, came in under the weight limit that the 4955 sat inside. They were in the same class by 400 pounds. 7 tractors had already run by the time Dale's 4955 was called to the line. The best pull of the day was 93 feet, set by a modified Allis-Chalmers WD-45 running on alcohol fuel, driven by a farmer from Red Cloud named Ed Corrigan. Ed's tractor had been pulling competitively for 4 seasons, and the modifications to its engine were the result of careful, incremental work. 93 feet was a serious number. 3 of the 7 tractors had made full pulls in earlier heats, but none had reached 93 feet in the finals configuration with the full sled weight. Cody Watts pulled the 4955 to the starting line, and the crowd gathered the way crowds gather at the pull track, 3 and 4 deep along the safety rope, the children up front, the farmers in the back with their arms crossed and their caps pulled low. Dale Pruitt stood at the rope with his bank envelope and his bullhorn and his certainty. The starter gave the signal. Cody engaged the clutch with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from practice. The 4955 hit the sled, and the exhaust stack blew black, and then cleared, and the tractor moved forward. It was impressive. There was no other honest word for it. The 4955 found its pull and walked the sled down the track with a steadiness that drew a long, approving sound from the crowd. Past 30 feet, past 50, past 70. The sled was loading now, the weight transfer doing its work, and the engine note changed as the load climbed. Cody held the throttle wide and held the line true, and the tractor kept moving. 80 feet, 85, 90, 91, 92. At 92 feet and approximately 8 inches, the front wheels began to lift. Cody corrected immediately, pulled the throttle back half a notch, and the wheels settled. But the momentum was broken. The tractor slowed. At 93 feet even, identical to Ed Corrigan's mark, the 4955 stopped pulling forward and the sled anchor dropped. The crowd cheered. It was a genuine pull and a genuine result. 93 feet, tied for the lead. Dale Pruitt applauded his own tractor with the bullhorn still in his hand, and then turned toward the track apron where Roy Hennessy was already climbing up onto the seat of the Farmall M. The Farmall M had been built at International Harvester's Rock Island plant and delivered new in the spring of 1952 to Roy's father, Walter Hennessy, for the sum of $1,140. Walter Hennessy had saved for it for 4 years. Before it arrived, he had farmed with horses. He bought the Farmall M because his neighbor had bought one in 1950 and cleared a field in a single afternoon that had taken Walter 3 days with his team. Walter had stood at the fence watching and said nothing for a long time, and then walked back to his house and sat at the kitchen table with his account book. Roy was 28 years old when his father died in 1952, which was also the year the Farmall M arrived. He inherited both the farm and the tractor. He had been farming with that machine for 35 years by the time he pulled it to the starting line at the Harlan County Fair. In those 35 years, Roy had rebuilt the engine twice. The first time was in 1961 when a cracked sleeve let water into the oil during the harvest, and he stripped the engine down on a set of sawhorses in the barn over 3 winter weekends. and rebuilt it from the crankshaft up. The second time was in 1978, when he decided the engine had earned a full refresh, and he did the work himself again, measuring tolerances with a dial indicator he had bought used from a machine shop in Hastings. He knew every specification of that engine, the way some men know Scripture. The modifications Roy had made for the pull were legal within class rules and had taken him 11 years to arrive at. Not 11 years of constant work, 11 years of observation, of watching other tractors pull, of reading what little technical literature existed on the subject, of talking to old engineers at implement shows, of testing one change at a time and keeping notes in a composition book that lived on the shelf above his workbench. He had increased the compression ratio. He had rejetted the carburetor for the Nebraska altitude and the August temperature. He had balanced the flywheel himself, using a technique he had read about in a 1949 issue of Farm Mechanics magazine that he kept in a plastic sleeve. What he had also done, and what no one at the Harlan County Fair knew about, was modify the hitch geometry. This was not a visible modification. It was a matter of angles. The Farmall M's standard drawbar sat at a specific height relative to the rear axle. Roy had fabricated a custom drawbar mount over the winter of 1985, working from calculations he had made on the back of a seed corn envelope. The mount allowed him to adjust the drawbar height in 2-inch increments. For a transfer sled pull on a packed clay track, the angle at which a tractor applies force to the sled changes the vertical load on the rear axle, which changes the effective traction, which changes everything. Roy had figured this out not from a textbook, but from 30 years of watching tractors bog and spin on pull tracks across the state and asking himself why. Dale Pruitt did not know any of this. When Roy climbed onto the Farmall M and the starter crew aligned the tractor with the sled, Dale raised the bullhorn again and said, loud enough for the whole crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a hand to the most expensive boat anchor in Harlan County." The laughter was real. Even some of the farmers along the rope smiled, not because they were cruel men, but because the Farmall M did look from the outside like it had no business being on the same track as the 4955. Roy adjusted his drawbar to the 4th position. He had decided on the 4th position 3 days earlier based on the weather forecast, the expected track condition, and a figure he had written in his composition book after the 1985 pull in Alma. He had not told anyone this. He had not told anyone anything. He had loaded the tractor on the flatbed at 5 in the morning and driven to the fair and checked in with the pull committee and walked the track once, slowly, and written one number in his book and snapped it shut. He engaged the clutch. The Farmall M's engine did not announce itself the way the 4955 had. It did not blow a column of black smoke or generate a sound that could be described as impressive. It produced a steady, medium-pitched diesel note, except it was not diesel, it was gasoline, which was itself unusual in 1987 when most competition tractors had converted, and it hit the sled chain and pulled. The crowd, which had been prepared to watch a curiosity, went quiet in a way they had not gone quiet for any of the previous 7 tractors. Roy did not hit the sled and immediately power through it. He came in under the throttle and let the sled chain load gradually, the way you settle weight onto a blister without breaking it. By the time the sled began to move, the Farmall M's rear tires had found their grip without a single inch of spin. No smoke from the tires, no violent surge, just movement, 30 feet. Dale Pruitt stopped talking. 45 feet. Ed Corrigan, who was still standing at the rope with the ribbon for his 93-foot pull pinned to his shirt, uncrossed his arms. 60 feet. A woman near the pie tables, who had been having a conversation that had nothing to do with tractor pulls, walked over to the rope without stopping her sentence and trailed off mid-word when she saw what was on the track. 70 feet. The sled was at full load now. The weight transfer had the front of the sled riding high and the ground anchor dragging hard. This was the point where the 4955 had slowed and then stopped. This was the point where 6 of the 7 previous tractors had left their marks in the clay. The Farmall M did not slow. It did not surge either. It simply continued at the same measured pace, the same steady engine note, on the same rear tires gripping and releasing and gripping again in the continuous rolling motion that is the whole secret of tractor pulling. Not maximum force, but continuous force, applied without interruption. 80 feet. An old farmer at the back of the crowd, a man in his mid-70s named Gus Pelletier, who had farmed in Harlan County since 1948, said one word to the man standing next to him. "Look." 85 feet. Cody Watts, who was still standing near the 4955 with a styrofoam cup of coffee, set the cup down on the fender of the nearest trailer without looking at it and kept his eyes on the Farmall M 90 feet. Dale Pruitt had lowered the bullhorn to his side. His sales manager, Randy Fowler, was standing 2 steps behind him, holding the bank envelope, and he had taken 1 step back without appearing to notice he had done it. 93 feet. The mark. The line where every other tractor had stopped. The Farmall M kept moving. The crowd made a sound that was not quite cheering yet. It was the sound of disbelief making its way toward belief, the way a man tests ice before he steps onto it. Several people grabbed each other's arms. A teenage boy in a John Deere cap turned to his father, and his mouth was open. 95 feet, 97, 99. At 100 feet exactly, the pull committee's flag dropped and the sled anchor locked, and the Farmall M rolled forward 1 additional inch into the full pull zone, and Roy Hennessy cut the throttle. The anchor locked. The chain went slack. Roy set the brake and climbed down from the seat in the same unhurried way he had climbed up, and he was checking the hitch pin again, the same way he had been checking it when Dale Pruitt announced his $8,000 bet, before the crowd sound reached full volume. It reached full volume. The noise at the Harlan County Fair pull track at approximately 3:15 on a Saturday afternoon in August of 1987 was the kind of noise that people would describe to their grandchildren. Ed Corrigan, whose 93-foot pull had led the competition for the previous 40 minutes, started clapping first and clapped harder than anyone. Gus Pelletier put 2 fingers in his mouth and produced a whistle that would have been impressive in a man 40 years younger. The teenagers who had taken photographs of the Farmall M as a curiosity were now trying to take photographs of Roy, who was coiling his safety chain and did not appear to notice them. Dale Pruitt stood at the rope and did not move for a long time. The pull committee chairman, Bill Sutter, walked over to Dale and said something quietly. Dale nodded once. He walked across the track apron to where Roy was standing beside the Farmall M, still attending to the tractor, still not looking toward the crowd. Dale stopped a few feet away and waited until Roy looked up. "Roy," Dale said, and then stopped. He started again. "I said some things today that I should not have said." He paused. "I called your tractor a boat anchor, in front of everyone here." He looked at his shoes for a moment and then back up. "I was completely wrong. About the tractor and about you." Roy straightened up from the hitch. He looked at Dale Pruitt for a moment with the kind of look that is not unfriendly and not warm, just level, the way a man looks at the horizon to check the weather. "The 4955 is a fine tractor," Roy said. "Your boy drove it well." Dale waited. He seemed to understand that Roy wasn't finished. "The problem with the 4955 today wasn't horsepower," Roy said. It was angle. When the drawbar sits too high on a transfer sled, the rear axle lifts under load instead of pushing down. More horsepower doesn't fix that. It makes it worse. He looked back at the Farmall M. My daddy's tractor is lighter, but the force was going where it needed to go. Dale Pruitt stood with that for a moment. I've been selling tractors for 19 years, he finally said. I never knew that. Most people don't, Roy said. No shame in it. Dale reached out his hand and Roy shook it, and the handshake lasted 1 second longer than handshakes usually do, and when it was done, something had passed between the two men that could not be taken back. Randy Fowler brought the bank envelope to Roy that evening at the pull committee table. Roy accepted it without ceremony and handed it directly to the Harlan County Historical Society representative who had been standing nearby since someone in the crowd had called the society's president 45 minutes earlier to explain what was happening. The Historical Society had helped Roy restore the Farmall M's sheet metal in 1983. And Roy had told the pull committee at registration that any winnings and any side bet proceeds would go there. The representative, a retired schoolteacher named Agnes Dvorak, accepted the envelope and shook Roy's hand and said, "Walter would have loved this." Roy said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back to loading the Farmall M onto the flatbed. The story was at the Alma Co-op by Monday morning. By Wednesday it had reached the feed store in Oxford and the diner in Arapahoe. By the following Sunday it was in the church parking lot conversation in 4 separate townships, told by people who had been there and people who had heard it from people who had been there, and the details stayed remarkably accurate because the details were the kind that stick. The specific dollar amount of the bet, the specific distance of the full pull, the specific thing Roy had said about angle and axle load. People repeated it because it was true, and because true things, when they are also remarkable, travel on their own. Dale Pruitt told the story himself. He told it to his sales staff at the John Deere dealership in Holdrege the following Tuesday morning, and he told it without softening any of his own words. He quoted himself accurately. He said, "boat anchor," and "rusted out," and watched his salespeople's faces and said, "And I was wrong. I want you all to understand exactly how wrong I was and exactly why." He had one of his service technicians measure the drawbar height on every tractor they sold for the next year and create a reference card for customers who pulled competitively. He kept a photograph of the Farmall M on the wall of his office. Not a photograph he had taken himself, but one that a fair photographer had snapped at the moment of the full pull, with the crowd visible along the rope and the flag just dropping and the red tractor still moving forward. He bought it from the photographer for $12 and had it framed. He told his wife that night what Roy had said about angle and force, and she had listened and then said, "It sounds like he's saying that power without direction is just noise." Dale had looked at her for a moment and said, "That's exactly what he's saying." He wrote that down, not because he needed to, because he wanted to remember that someone else had found the same truth in a different language, and he had almost missed it. Roy drove the Farmall M home that Saturday evening, arriving back on his property outside Alma just before dark. He fueled it, checked the oil, and put it in the barn. He hung the pull champion ribbon from the 1987 Harlan County Fair on the same nail where the 1981 ribbon hung, and the 1979 ribbon, and the 1976 ribbon. He cooked himself a supper of fried eggs and toast and went to bed. He made no telephone calls. He drove into Alma the following Wednesday for supplies, same as every Wednesday. At the co-op, 3 men he knew stopped him to talk about the pull. He listened to what they said and answered their questions plainly, and did not add details that would have made a better story. When one of the men asked if he had known all along that he would beat the 4955, Roy said, "I knew the method was right, Whether the method is enough, you never know that until it's done. Then he bought his supplies and drove home. He started the Farmall M on the 1st of September just to run it. He let it warm up at idle for 10 minutes and then drove it up the field road and back. He checked the hitch, checked the carburetor adjustment, checked the tire pressure, and put it back in the barn. He did this on the 1st of every month, October through May, and had done it every month since 1952. Not because anyone told him to, because his father had told him that a machine you only use when you need it will not be there when you need it. He had found that to be true of most things. His son David was 31 years old in 1987, farming a section of land adjacent to Roy's place. David had grown up on the Farmall M, had learned to drive on it at age 9, had helped rebuild it in 1978 by handing tools and holding lights and asking the particular questions that 9-year-olds ask when they are genuinely curious. He knew the machine the way Roy knew it, not from reading, but from hours and years of hands-on presence. He also knew the composition book on the shelf above the workbench, and he had read it front to back twice. In October of 1987, 2 months after the Harlan County Fair, Roy sat with David at the kitchen table after supper and slid the composition book across to him. David looked at it and then looked at his father. Roy said, "You know most of what's in there. The rest you'll figure out." He got up and cleared the dishes. That was the whole conversation. David took the book home that night and put it on the shelf above his own workbench. Roy transferred the formal ownership of the Farmall M to David in the spring of 1994, when Roy was 70 years old and his hip made climbing up onto the seat more difficult than he was willing to admit. He kept farming. He just let David do the pulling. David pulled the Farmall M at the Harlan County Fair for the first time in 1995, 8 years after his father's pull against Dale Pruitt's 4955. He had updated 3 entries in the composition book. 1 carburetor adjustment for the reformulated fuel that had become common by the mid-90s, 1 note about track surface variation in wet August conditions, and 1 additional drawbar position he had discovered through his own testing. He won the modified stock class by 11 feet. Dale Pruitt's son, a man named Greg Pruitt, who had taken over the John Deere dealership in Holdrig from his father in 1993, was in the crowd at the 1995 fair. He was 34 years old, and he had grown up hearing the story of the 1987 pull the way other children grow up hearing fairy tales, except this one was set at a county fair in Nebraska and ended with his father standing at a kitchen table writing something in a notebook. Greg stood at the rope and watched David Hennessy's Farmall M make its full pull, and he felt something that took him a moment to identify. He walked over after the pull and introduced himself. David shook his hand and said he knew who he was. Greg said his father had asked him to say hello if he ever found himself at a Harlan County pull. Then Greg asked if he could look at the drawbar setup. David showed him. Greg spent 10 minutes looking at the hitch geometry and asking questions and writing things in a small notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. David answered every question. Before Greg left, he asked David how old the tractor was. 43 years, David said. Greg looked at the Farmall M for a moment. It doesn't look tired, he said. It isn't, David said. The Farmall M sat in David's barn through the winters and went to the county fair every August and started on the 1st of every month from October through May, the same as it always had. The pull ribbons accumulated on the nail beside the barn door, a different nail from Roy's nail, but the same wall, same barn, because David had bought his father's property in 1998, when Roy could no longer manage the full acreage alone. Roy moved into the smaller house at the back of the property and came down to the barn most mornings to check on things, which mostly meant checking on the Farmall M. which mostly meant running his hand along the hood the way you run your hand along the flank of a horse, you have known for a long time. He died in 2003 at 79 in the smaller house at the back of the property with the composition book on the nightstand beside him because David had brought it in thinking he might want it, and he had. He had made 3 additional entries in the final 2 years of his life, observations he had made watching David pull, things he had noticed from the ground that he wanted written down before they existed only in his memory. The last entry in the composition book, made in Roy's handwriting in the spring of 2002, read, "4th position, wet clay, temperature above 78. Still holds. David's son, a boy named Tyler, who was 12 in 2003, I had grown up the way David had grown up, learning the Farmall M from the seat down, from the sound of the engine, from the composition book on the shelf. By the time he was 15, he could adjust the drawbar in the dark. By the time he was 18, he had read the composition book cover to cover enough times that certain pages had softened at the corners. The Farmall M went to the Harlan County Fair every August, and every August it started on the 3rd pull of the crank. Not the first, never the first, always the 3rd, reliably the 3rd, as if that were simply the agreement the engine had made with the world and saw no reason to renegotiate. It still pulled what nothing else could pull, not because it was the strongest machine on the track, because it had been maintained by people who understood that patience is a form of power, that angle matters more than force, and that the knowledge stored in a composition book on a workbench shelf outlasts every model year and every horsepower rating and every confident man with a bullhorn standing at the rope, believing that newer means better. Some things don't get stronger by being replaced. They get stronger by being understood.